Hello and welcome to the Peace Talk and welcome to another episode, this time with Professor Radhika Desai. My name is Josef Mühlbauer. I'm working for the University of Graz in Austria, and today I have the great honor and privilege to speak to a great academic. Radhika Desai is a professor at the Department of Political Science and director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba in Canada. She is also a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. She's also the convener of the International Manifesto group, which can be found on the website internationalmanifesto.org. She published and edited several scientific books and research papers and articles, for example, Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire from 2013, and edited and co-edited many scientific books and papers such as Russia, Ukraine, and Contemporary Imperialism, a special issue of International Critical Thought from 2016. And today we're going to dig deeper into the edited work of her theoretical engagement in geopolitical economy from 2015. So having said that, please visit also her website, radhikadesai.com. Thank you, dear Radhika, for taking the time, and thank you that you followed my invitation for this interview.
Great, Joseph. Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Let's begin with the theoretical foundations of geopolitical economy, and let's dive deeper into your book that you edited called Theoretical Engagement in Geopolitical Economy. There you position geopolitical economy as an alternative, and also it is a critique to mainstream international political economy. So maybe let's distinguish these two. What is the difference between the mainstream international political economy, and how does your theoretical framework reject or criticize mainstream economy, neoclassic equilibrium focus, and why is it that you, in your opinion, it is a bourgeois ideology? Let's begin with this whole set of questions.
Okay, that's a lot of questions. So feel free to interrupt me if you want any clarifications, because otherwise I'll just go on for a long time. So first of all, international political economy is a fairly new discipline in the sense that people will say that it basically emerged only in the 1970s, basically, to try to understand the complex interaction of international politics and international economics, as they put it. But the use of the term political economy is a bit misleading, because if you think about classical political economy, which prevailed as the way of understanding the modern world, the capitalist world, until, Marx really brought it to its culmination by resolving many unresolved questions of it. That was really not something that separated economics from politics and so on. It looked as the evolution of society as a historical whole. And so in that sense, it was a very historical science, and international political economy, unfortunately, although it claimed that it is going to go beyond the normal separation of politics from economics, in fact, it has really functioned to perpetuate that separation, in the sense that it accepts neoclassical economics, which listeners must remember did not exist in the middle of the 19th century. It only came into existence in the late 19th century, in part, I would say, in response to Marx and other radical currents in classical political economy. In fact, even before Marx, there was Ricardian socialism. And in another part, in response to the fact that the working classes of Europe were beginning to organize and represented a major threat. And so this new type of economics, as they put it, was trotted out as a way of essentially countering, at least at the ideological, rhetorical, and policy level, this sort of challenge. And that is, about the time when the historical way of understanding society was abandoned, the holistic way of understanding society was abandoned, and we got the modern social sciences, because the core of the modern social sciences is economics. The modern neoclassical economics is the result of the work of the so-called marginalist revolution in circa 1870, when we are told that three economists, founding economists, Austria's own Karl Menger, the English Stanley Jevons, and the Frenchman or the Swiss, I guess, Léon Walras. All three of them arrived at roughly similar ways of understanding the economy, which was now separated from the rest of society. So economy and society were separate, and it's not Weber played a very important role, Max Weber played a very important role in sanctifying the separation. He said that in modern society, we have a problem. We have a situation in which different areas of human activity acquire an autonomy of their own. And therefore, they need to be discussed by different disciplines. So you've got economics and sociology as the founding separation. And then we've got the other social sciences, politics and so on, in a sort of modern social scientific division of labor. And these social sciences are ahistorical, and they divide up social reality into different parts. And this has never been a very satisfactory way of studying society. But the key was not really about the study of a society. The key was to essentially assert that the economy was out there operating on its own, under its own logic, and it was not correct to interfere in it. Now, up until now, governments had freely interfered in the economy in order to promote capitalism, to develop capitalism further, to help capitalists and so on, even to undertake imperialist projects on behalf of capital. But now that the working class had entered the political stage and could demand that the state also serve its interests, we were to be told that the economy should not be interfered with, that it was this sacrosanct object which should be allowed to function on its own. So this is essentially neoclassical economy. So to come back to international political economy basically accepts the standard neoclassical claim that the economy is self-regulating, that it should not be interfered with, so that politics is only brought in when the free market, free trade rules are broken, and you have to explain that somehow, and then you explain it by vested interest and the mendaciousness of, I don't know, governments or unions or what have you, and then so politics is only brought in as to explain the interference and with free markets and so on. And so essentially, the gospel of free markets lies at the heart of international political economy. And that makes it a fundamentally erroneous and ideological way of looking at the world, because the idea that markets are spontaneously harmonious is not true in reality. But this discipline adheres to it because it's the best way of defending the capitalist power structure of our societies. And of course, internationally, it's the best way of defending imperialism. So in both ways, so international political economy is kind of, not really doing what it says on the tin. So that's why I ended up criticizing. And I'll say one other thing about IPE before I go on to geopolitical economy. International political economy, because it adheres to this notion of free markets and free trade as being natural, spontaneous, etc., inherently good and desirable and irreversible and unstoppable, etc. Because it does that, it has tended to accept what I call cosmopolitan accounts of the world economy. So these cosmopolitan accounts are essentially accounts that assume that the world economy is a single whole, whether the world economy is unified by markets as under the logic of free trade rhetoric or globalization ideology, or whether it is united by a leading state as under hegemony or empire theories. So IPE has also been the home of these ideologies, from where these ideologies are sort of certainly boosted, if not actually manufactured. So now, I actually started writing my 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire, as a critique just of globalization. I was just starting out, and I actually thought that I would use the idea of hegemony as a way of explaining globalization. So I originally set out to write a book in which the argument would be something like globalization is not a real social scientific understanding of what's happening to the world economy. There is no such thing as globalization, but it is an aspect or it is the ideology of the US, in particular the US state, the US ruling classes, in order to manage a particular stage of the hegemonic decline. Now, if I were to use the term hegemonic decline, then I must adhere to the idea that at least once upon a time, the US was hegemonic. But as I began researching the book, I realized that the idea of hegemony also does not hold water. Not only does the idea of globalization not hold water, the idea of US hegemony does not hold water. You cannot really operationalize the idea. There are as many definitions, if not more, than there are writers on the subject. Everybody chooses their own convenient thing in order to describe in order to say what they want to say. So then the book actually became, as I say, a critique of these cosmopolitanisms. And I essentially felt that I would, having been, I essentially felt that a properly Marxist way of understanding world affairs was needed. And so that's what I developed, and that's what I call geopolitical economy. So you talked about this book, edited collection, Theoretical Engagements in Geopolitical Economy, and along with that book, I also ended up writing a whole lot of other side pieces because they were necessary as a sort of theoretical ground clearing in order to establish essentially geopolitical economy. And in this process, I not only criticized neoclassical economics, etc., but I also found, to my great surprise and dismay, that a very large part of what passes for Marxism around the world, but particularly in the West, including what passes for Marxist economics, it has actually ended up compromising with neoclassical economics. Given that neoclassical economics had emerged in good part to oppose Marxism and to oppose the working class, there should have been a frontal contestation of it. But what you find is that there isn't such a frontal contestation. And most people who call themselves Marxist economists, although they belong to at least 2 or 3 different schools, they tend to all adhere to the idea that Marx's analysis does not work because they kind of accept the criticism of it from neoclassical economics and make other such accusations. So geopolitical economy is therefore a better way of understanding world affairs in which a Marxist understanding of capitalism is central. In that understanding, capitalism is contradictory value production. So it's value production which is inherently contradictory. And therefore, a state is always necessary to manage those contradictions, both through domestic actions, whether it is concessions to the working class, regulation of capital, or what have you, or through international actions, which takes the form, of course, of imperialism. So in geopolitical economy, imperialism, and then also the resistance to imperialism, because you have to think about contradictions, you have to think dialectically. So the resistance to imperialism, they are both central. So imperialism and anti-imperialism are central to understanding the international relations of the capitalist world. And final quick point I'll say is that I also managed, much of this theoretical ground clearing was to show that contrary to the idea that Marx didn't understand the role of the state, that Marx did not really understand imperialism, etc., even that he was Eurocentric. I show that actually in the work of Marx and Engels, although Marx did not finish Capital. If he had written he had planned a 6 to 8 volume work in which one of the volumes would have been about world trade, in which if he had lived to write it, we would have learned what he thought about imperialism and the world economy and so on. He didn't manage to write it, but he said enough about how he saw the relations between countries in the age of capital that we have what I call geopolitical economy, and what Marx which is really about what he called the relations of producing nations. So for him, the international relations are also about how social, what is a social form of production, named particularly the dominance of capital, and then you describe it. So I'll leave it there. It's been a long enough answer so far. So.
Thank you for your insights. Speaking of regulation, that the state is regulating the contradiction, what came up to my mind was the regulation theory, Aglietta. And in France and in Germany, it's quite popular. And in this sense, it has some similarities, in my opinion. It's also a Marxist, it follows a Marxist tradition, yeah. I wanted to ask you the following. Given the crisis since 2008, the Lehman Brothers crisis or bubble that caused a world economic crisis. The rising geopolitical tensions and all the phenomenon that we see. How does geopolitical economy provides us a lens and a more maybe analytical tool for understanding phenomena like deglobalization, decoupling, de-risking? They frame it in different ways sometimes. The current sanction regimes. You stated before that this liberal idea or maybe neoliberal idea of free market and the market will regulate itself and so on and so forth. But we see exactly the contrary. Not only under Trump, it started even before, and also the weaponization of finance and does that contradict the neoliberal theoreticians, or maybe some who romanticize this theory, they say, or maybe from the libertarian sides, they say, okay, but neoliberalism never existed in the pure form, and yeah. So what's your take on that, and how can your theoretical framework help us understand this phenomenon, like de-risking, decoupling, and so on?
Sure. So first of all, I would say that not only has neoliberalism never existed, but it could not really exist, because if you actually had free markets, free trade, and a kind of minimal sort of night watchman state, and in fact, some extreme neoliberals would also reduce the role of the state even further than that. But you simply couldn't have it, because if left to itself, capitalism would have destroyed itself a long time ago. So in a certain sense, you can't really have a self-regulating free market society. So that would be the first point. The second point then I would make is that how do I explain the current trends towards deglobalization and the other points that you made? Well, one of the points that geopolitical economy makes, and this is particularly well brought out in one of the chapters of my newer book, the 2023 book, Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, a Geopolitical Economy, which, by the way, is open access. So you can download it for free if you want just the PDF. But anyway, so what I argue is that essentially, as I said, geopolitical economy puts imperialism and anti-imperialism at its core. So the argument then is that imperialism reached a peak in 1914, so on the eve of the First World War. The First World War was a great, and the 30 years crisis that it inaugurated was a great cataclysmic crisis of the capitalist world. And since that time, imperialism has in fact been declining in power. Not as fast as you and I might like, not as fast as the world needs, but nevertheless, it has been on a long, slow decline. I mean, and sometimes it has looked, for example, in the 1980s and 1990s, when it looked as though imperialism was revived and it was imposing this immiseration on the world in the form of structural adjustment programs and imposing its neoliberal ideology and so on, which set third world countries back so grievously and so horribly. It looks like so there may have been reverses, but on the whole, it has been declining. And this decline is accelerated by the fact that also around the early 20th century, something else happened that Marx had predicted, and but he only lived to see the very early phases. So there are parts of Marx's writings where he very clearly articulates the point that when capitalism arrives at the monopoly phase, and it must arrive at the monopoly phase because monopoly is the final result of competition. Because what does competition do? It eliminates all the less successful producers, it strengthens the more successful producers, and eventually there's only one or two remaining. And this is also, of course, accompanied by a process of the centralization and concentration of capital into a few small, into a small number of very large enterprises. Now, one can talk more about that, but briefly, then at this point, Marx says, any historical role that capitalism had would have been exhausted. Any historical progressive role that capitalism had would have been exhausted, that capitalism was now ripe for takeover by socialism. Again, as I say, we can discuss this point further, and in a certain sense, Marx was right. But you see, what happened is you had the First World War, you had the 30 Years crisis of two world wars, a Great Depression, great breakdown in world trade, etc. And then you got the golden age of growth. And many people say, well, the golden age showed that capitalism had a lot more life left in it. Everybody, including people like Lenin, who had thought, and by the way, Lenin, Keynes, Karl Polanyi, many other such intellectuals genuinely thought that capitalism was absolutely finished. And they were not wrong. They were witness to the greatest cataclysm to afflict humanity. I mean, up to that point and probably since. So they basically felt that this is finished, we have to go in a different direction. But then the golden age is taken as proof that capitalism had a lot more life left in it, that this idea that capitalism, is going to die is over. But now, at this point in time, in 2025, we are standing at, standing at about 45 years of neoliberalism. And what was neoliberalism? It was an attempt to roll back the reforms of the post-war golden age. And my argument in Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War is that standing from at this point, in a vantage point in history, it's very clear that what made the golden age golden in terms of growth was the reforms of capitalism, because it disciplined capital to some extent. It expanded domestic demand massively, and so on. And of course, there was also actually existing communism, which contributed an enormous amount to world growth, because actually, unlike capitalist societies, growth in the Soviet Union and eventually in China was fairly consistent. They didn't have the ups and downs of capitalist business cycles and so on. So all of these reasons made the golden age golden. But the moment you began to roll back these reforms of the Keynesian welfare state and so on, you began and you began to roll them back both in first world countries, then in third world countries, and eventually also, of course, in the communist world. You've had 4.5 decades of low growth, low investment, financialization, increasing inequality, etc. And this is not an exception. This is not just a particularly degenerate form of capitalism. This is the only thing. This is the only way capitalism can exist today. This is the only form capitalism can take. So it is capitalism. We have witnessed this. And so in that sense, actually, that leftward turn at the end of the Second World War should have been sustained, that humanity would be better off today than we are, in fact. And so to me, that is another element, sorry. So to return to my main argument, imperialism, therefore, has been declining. Then for a time, it looked as though the West was succeeding in the 80s and 90s on imposing its will on the rest of the world, but it did not last. And now what we see is, as a result of the, as a combination, even though, and of course, for a while in the 1990s, everybody thought, well, capitalism has won, socialism is finished, so this is like the ultimate triumph of capitalism. But no, that victory was a Pyrrhic victory, because the underlying the appearances was the objective decline of capitalism, which can no longer generate growth. It can no longer generate jobs. It can merely be an economy as it's of takers rather than makers. And this kind of economy is increasingly unsustainable. So what this is doing is, so capitalism itself is declining. Now, internationally, I would say that, when the Soviet Union ended, everybody thought that there would be like two major effects of this. Number one, the world would be ruled under the benign hegemony of the United States. We would have unipolarity. And second, the world would enjoy a peace dividend. But of course, for the reasons that I've already mentioned, with capitalism continuing to decline, we have not seen unipolarity, but multipolarity. Particularly with the rise of China, I would say perhaps even a new form of bipolarity with the US and China. But this time it's different because, back in the 50s and 60s, in the days of the original Cold War, you had the United States as a relatively stable and, prospering economy. But now you have a very different type of United States, which is rapidly sliding while China continues to rise. So there. And the second thing was you would get a peace dividend. Both of these you are not getting because the accelerated decline of the West, US-led West, is actually producing more militarism. And of course, the use and the West is now in such dire straits that it can itself no longer sustain the open world economy which it had once sponsored. So now it is violating the rules of that open world economy, whether it is in Trump's tariffs or the weaponization of the dollar system. And remember also that Trump was not the first to impose tariffs. I remember clearly as if it was yesterday, George Bush Jr. imposing steel and aluminium tariffs on on China. So we've had this kind of the West kind of essentially destroying the very system that it needs to dominate the world, because basically its power to dominate the world is exhausted. It's still trying. It's trying, and in the process, it is inflicting death, destruction, and terrible suffering, particularly today in Gaza, around the world. But it cannot succeed. I mean, this is just a question of how hard the West will try before must finally admit failure.
Absolutely. And also, you mentioned that in the golden age, the so-called Fordism, like mass production, mass employment, and so on and so forth. Capitalism creates growth, but at the expense of the environment, of the resources, for example, or mostly of the global south, and also cheap labor forces. So it comes with a cost, so to speak, but we, especially in the global north, we tend not to see it, or it's comfortable not to see it. Sitting in Austria, it's quite comfortable.
Right.
Capitalism treat me very well. So
yes. Well, I think not just in Austria. I think that you, as a member of, or an aspirant member of the professional middle class, is doing quite well out of this. But I would say that working people everywhere, ordinary working people everywhere who are not so privileged in the hierarchy of work, in the hierarchy of the job system, the employment system, they are feeling the pinch. I would say I'm currently living in the UK. Because I'm on leave from Canada, and I can see an enormous amount of suffering, an enormous amount of economic hardship that is already being visited. But let's leave that aside. I mean, first of all, so you pointed out that capitalism does create growth, it created Fordism, etc. But the fact is that the growth dynamic of capitalism under neoliberalism has slowed down. And remember, what was the rationale of neoliberalism? It was that if you free capital from the obligations and the burdens that were imposed upon it during the golden age, then it will perform better. But by every measure, it has performed worse. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that you mentioned environmental destruction. If you look at the index of any of the measures of environmental destruction, whether it is global warming, pollution, biodiversity loss, those are the three main ones. If you look at an index, you will see that from the, depending on what kind of statistics you are getting, but from the early to mid 19th century, it is growing at a certain pace. It's not declining for sure. But once you get to circa 1980, they all spike up. And that the growth is much more so oddly enough, of course, I'm not at all denying that we all need to restrain our resource footprints. We all need to restrain our carbon footprints. We all need to restrain, we all need to prevent pollution and all those things. And this is all necessary. But it's not about growth, because when the world economy was growing much faster, the level of environmental destruction was not so great. There is something about the neoliberal pattern of growth that has accelerated environmental destruction. Actually, there are also very interesting books that have been written and articles that have been written about, people just completely dismiss the experience of socialism. They assume that socialism was just as bad, if not worse, than capitalism on the environmental issues. This is actually not true. Socialist countries had the capacity to take a larger view. They had the capacity to plan. And when you have the capacity to plan, you can actually control environmental destruction. Marx says somewhere at the beginning of the section on rent, in volume 3 of Capital, one of the earliest remarks he makes is that under a regime of private ownership, you cannot have rational agronomy, by which he means a rational use of the land, which is basically some version of environmentalism. And you can't, if you have private ownership, it means every private owner is more or less free to do what they like. And you can't have any environmental planning in that context. So historically, the record of the Soviet Union in the past, or China today, let alone smaller capitalist countries, smaller socialist countries like Vietnam or Cuba, is actually much better on the environmental front. And of course, China today is in the forefront of environmental technology, environmentally, producing things that would be conducive to a control of our impact on the environment, etc. So for all these reasons, I'd say that we really have to rethink this idea that capitalism produces growth. It has not produced growth. It produced growth for about three decades after the Second World War, not because it was capitalism, but because it was heavily reformed. And these reforms constrained it. They sort of put it in this pathway where it had few options but to produce a relatively benign type of growth with more equality, with less environmental destruction, etc.
I wonder, how do you define imperialism? For example, Rosa Luxemburg wrote that capitalism and capitalist national states need, so to speak, something outside capitalism to, impose their, products or will or whatever. And and to have a new market where you can place your products and so on and so forth. And Lenin did it in a different version. So he also stated that there is monopoly, and then this monopoly, the national border is too small, and so it needs also an outside. So in contrast to these thinkers, how would you define, or maybe you follow this tradition, but in contrast to this, how do you define imperialism? And why is it that so many, for example, liberal thinkers think of, when we talk about imperialism, as a phase in human history that is a long time past, a long time ago, and now we are over, and so yeah, maybe we start from here.
Yeah, sure. The liberals, of course, like to call Russia and China imperialist, whereas they are not. But okay, let's begin with how I define it, and then I'll come to Lenin and Luxemburg, and then we'll come to the liberal discourse about imperialism today. So first of all, I would define imperialism like to continue with something I said earlier. So capitalism, I take very seriously Marx's view that it is value production. So unlike any other previously existing human society, capitalism does not produce, I don't know, computers or cars or houses or whatever. Capitalism seeks to produce value, and the production of computers or cars or houses or buses is supposed to be a byproduct of that. And this value production and appropriation of value, the accumulation of value, is inherently contradictory. it is prone to a number of contradictions at every possible level. So not only are there contradictions with respect to how value is produced, but also how it is realized in the market. Because, you know, if in the process of producing value, I have chosen to produce, I don't know, notebooks, and then I have to, I produce notebooks in which the value I have produced is embodied, including the value I have extracted from my workers. But then I have to sell the notebooks in order to realize the value in money form, which is the only form that value can take. So in these core realms of production and realization or whatever, you have contradictions. And then you see there are also, these are just the core processes of value production. But in sustaining these core processes, you need to have a state, you need to have money, you need to have some kind of relationship between yourself and the environment, you will inevitably have international relations, etc. So there are a whole range of other realms of society that need to be what's the word for it, distorted, modified in order for capitalism to exist. And so all of these realms, the family, you can add that to, all of these realms have to be distorted and bent out of shape in order to support capitalism. And as they are, they also become arenas in which you can have crises of various sorts. So to me, this is, and as I say, a state is necessary to manage this. And the state manages this through domestic action, whether it is regulating capital or creating political compromise between capitalists and workers and so on. And it operates internationally. And internationally in its operation, again, it can either, well, imperialism involves managing your relations with your peer imperialist powers, because capitalism is plural. It's not, just, there's no one world capitalist power. There are many capitalist powers. So you have to manage these horizontal relationships between imperial countries. You use the word global north. I think the old-fashioned term imperialist countries is much better. Okay, but so they have to arrange these relationships, and they have to create a relationship between their own economies and the subordinated world, so that the needs of their economies are met. Okay, so just focusing on the latter part for now, I would say that capitalism always requires a subordinated periphery. And the function of the subordinated periphery is to do at least four things, which I take in two pairs. Two things related to inputs. So the subordinated periphery must provide cheap inputs, and it must provide cheap labor. And then the other two have to do with outputs. It must accept the excess commodities that capitalism produces, and it must accept the excess capital that capitalism produces. Now, these two pairs of needs are actually contradictory to one another, because on the one hand, the subordinated periphery can only supply cheap goods and cheap labor, cheap inputs and cheap labor, if it is kept very poor. But on the other hand, if it is to accept capitalist excess commodities and be a market for capitalism and be an outlet for capitalist excess capital, then it has to be sufficiently prosperous and sufficiently stable to do so. So actually, I won't go into great detail, but the complex history of capitalism has been such that, up until about, essentially what capitalism did historically was it would subordinate one part of the world, and for a time it would serve as a market, but that time would be quite short, because very soon the inflow of cheap commodities from first world countries, from imperialist countries into this subordinated country, would destroy that economy, would deindustrialize the economy, a process that Rosa Luxemburg particularly was sensitive to. And then now, and once, of course, all the territories of the world are so subordinated, they are impoverished. They can, and historically, in the 20th century, in the latter part of the 20th century, these parts of the world have not really served the function of accepting excess commodities. I mean, who cares if Somalians are able to buy, I don't know, Samsung phones or whatever? They don't care. It's mostly the first world countries that serve as the market, the imperialist countries that serve as a market for each other. And they also serve as outlets for capital, again, for each other, because apart from China, and maybe a few other favored countries. On the whole, capitalists don't invest in third world countries. What they have done is they have created value chains, but the investment does not come from the Western countries. It comes from the subordinated periphery. But anyway, so this is imperialism to me, and imperialism therefore has directly to do with capitalism and its contradictions. And as I say, it is declining. So the contradictions of capitalism are mounting, and the options for the imperial powers are narrowing. And that's why you see the tremendous militarism today and so on, because it's essentially capitalist countries having a tantrum. They can't stop their decline, but they can't accept it either. So they are throwing tantrum after tantrum. Okay, now Luxembourg and Lenin. I'm interested to see that you said Luxembourg defined imperialism in one way and Lenin did another. And in my book, I actually, in Geopolitical Economy, I actually say that, in the early 20th centuries, you got a sort of brilliant burst of writings about imperialism. So, of course, there was Luxembourg and Lenin, but also Hilferding, Bukharin. And earlier, there was John Hobson, whose work also Lenin, obviously, John Hobson had his limitations. He was a bourgeois writer in many ways. He was a racist writer, but he understood what he calls the economic taproot of imperialism. And that was to his credit, which not very many people could accept or understand, etc. So I divide them into two. So Luxembourg and Hobson belong to those that group in which they basically say that imperialism and capitalism have always gone together. So capitalism has always been imperialism. Luxembourg, Lenin, Bukharin, they do not deny this so much as they are very focused on trying to understand the new phase in the history of imperialism, which is characterized by tremendous competition among these imperial powers. There are now more than one. Earlier, before the middle of the 19th century, there was essentially just the expansion of England, particularly after England defeated France at key points in 1763. Then you simply had the expansion of England. And that was in the late 19th century, replaced by a competition among major European powers, eventually joined by the United States and Japan as well, for colonies. And this competition was for them directly connected up with a new phase of capitalism, which we would call the monopoly phase, which I described earlier. So for them, it was very much about, and Lenin particularly ended up, as I said, they never denied that imperialism, colonialism was a policy already from a long time back, but that, they were focused on this competition, and they also were focused on the fact that the new phase of capitalism gave an special edge because the needs of industry was now that much bigger. Its needs were that much greater, and its hold on the state, which it drove towards imperialism, that much closer, because a small number of big corporate capitalists can more easily control the state than a large number of smaller capitalists. So they described all these things, and but so they were focused on a phase, and in that focus they may have ended up somehow repeating certain things, certain errors. For example, the liberal notion that in the middle of the 19th century there was no imperialism. So but actually, as I say, they understood. But Lenin's reason for insisting that imperialism was a phase was not so much to say that, before there was no imperialism, but it was more to oppose people like Kautsky, who was sort of taking a more reformist line and saying that, imperialism is not a policy, because that implies that there are options, that these imperialist countries could cease to be imperialist. But Lenin said, no, they cannot cease to be imperialist because it is an imperative. So that this is a phase, and this phase was of intensified imperialism, more determined imperialism, and inter-imperialist competition. And in this, they were not wrong. So, of course, then inter-imperialist competition, of course, leads to the First World War and the 30 Years crisis that is caused because, remember, the entire period, First World War, Second World War, are connected because the Versailles Treaty did, we call it the Versailles Settlement, but the settlement settled nothing. And so you got essentially one large imperialist crisis which eventually resulted in another world war, or the continuation of the same world war. And the irony of it, and I'll leave it at this, is that it actually, had it not been for the fact that in the context of this imperialist crisis, there were the Bolshevik Revolution took place, and the Soviet Union was created, and Soviet Union industrialized very successfully and massively to become, by the mid-1930s, the second industrial power in the world. People forget that Soviet Union was able to do this. And of course, Chinese Communist forces generally, but they were dominated by Chinese Communist forces. So these forces were necessary to help capitalist countries resolve a crisis of their own creation. This is very, very important. This is something we forget continuously. You know, this year is the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And you know, we are, for the last many years, in fact, we've been living in a world where the leader of the one country that sacrificed the most lives to winning the First World War, namely the Soviet Union, now Russia, is not even invited to attend the commemoration ceremony. So it is really, the West is now in a process of telling itself so many lies that it will only be to the discredit, I think, and eventually it will lead to the West. You know, a self-delusion is not something that is helpful in any case. But I said I'll end here, so I'll end here for now.
Absolutely. And let's move on to the question that is also related to this one. Is the US an empire, for example, and how to measure if Russia is an empire, if China is an empire, for example, besides military bases and the obvious. For example, if you just look at nuclear heads, for example, let's count just nuclear heads. Okay, Russia is an empire. If we add, for example, just the lens that, okay, if a country invades another country, then Rwanda is also an empire. So it can't be that, okay, invading another country, okay, this makes you an empire. It can't be just nuclear heads, counting nuclear heads. So what is it? So, and why do you think that the US is still an empire? Maybe not. Maybe it was an empire and now it's crumbling. And yeah, and why also, and now here I'm referring to the paper that you published, co-edited, co-authored together with Alan Freeman and the great Boris Kagarlisky that was unfortunately in prison by the Russian authorities, put in prison because of his anti-war statements. And I'm referring to this paper. So why is Russia not an empire? And yeah, why is, for example, China an empire or not an empire? So let's compare these three big powers. And
if I've forgotten anything, do remind me. But let me just begin with this last point, which is, you know, let's begin with the question of the United States. Is the United States an empire? So my answer to this, which I give in Geopolitical Economy, the 2013 book, is that the United States, from the early 20th century, United States elites, United States ruling classes began nursing a desire to play a dominant role in the world. They saw that they could see that Britain had once played a dominant role in the world, but British power was weakening through because of a variety of reasons, including the US's own rise as an important industrial power. So Britain was losing export markets to the US and so on, and Germany, of course, and later on Japan as well. So in this context, the United States could see that Britain was weakening, and so it wished on its own to essentially replace Britain as what they call the managing segment of the world economy. So it wished to kind of dominate the rest of the world. And my argument is that the US pursued this ambition very zealously throughout the 20th century, but it never succeeded in realizing it, for the simple reason that the world had already become multipolar. The US pursued this ambition very zealously, but it never succeeded in realizing it, for the simple reason that the world had already become multipolar. Its own industrialization, along with that of Germany and later Japan, had made the world multipolar, and it was no longer possible for a single country to dominate the world. And you know, in a certain sense, it was the exact same reason why British power was waning. That scenario, that configuration could never be replicated. So, you know, you may have heard some people say that the US is hegemonic. You may have heard, or you know, whatever, imperialist or an empire. You may have heard other people say that it was once so, but is no longer. But my argument is it was never so. It could never be so. And we can go into the ins and outs of that, but it has, but that doesn't mean that it has not tried very zealously to do so. So now the US is a wannabe imperialist power, and in the pursuit of this ambition, it has, you know, done everything that it has, fought the wars it has the military bases that it has, it developed nuclear weapons precisely for that reason. You know, we are told that nuclear weapons were developed and used in order to prevent the loss of 500,000 lives that would have been lost if if the US had to invade Japan. But of course, this is complete rubbish, because Japan was already on its knees. Japan was already suing for peace, and so on. They developed nuclear weapons, and they used nuclear weapons because they wished to demonstrate to the Soviet Union that they had these weapons that were capable of inflicting terrible destruction, and thereby to halt what they considered to be or to counter the so-called what they considered the Soviet threat. So the US has done a lot. It fought wars in Vietnam, in Korea, and wherever not. It has caused enormous destruction. It has imposed structural adjustment on the world, which has taken lives. It has imposed sanctions on so many countries. They have also taken lives. So I'm not excusing any of it. What I am saying is that the US did not succeed, and it could not have succeeded. So that's the first point. The second point is that you are absolutely right. I mean, beginning from the early 20th century onwards, you know, Lenin said that by the end of the you know, by about 1914, essentially the world had been divided up among the major imperialist powers, and therefore only a redivision was possible. And the United States wasn't even into redividing it. It was not into creating a territorial empire. And capitalism does not need the creation of a territorial empire. What capitalism needs is the effective subordination of enough territories that they can do these four things that I had mentioned earlier. And the United States had been habituated up to that point. You know, they declared the Monroe Doctrine, of course, in 1823. We had the 200th anniversary of it a couple of years ago. But of course, it wasn't until the late 19th century that the United States began to have a navy that could actually enforce it. But it now began to enforce, you know, in the late 19th century, enforce the Monroe Doctrine to some extent. But the Monroe Doctrine had already habituated the United States to essentially try to subordinate nominally independent countries, formally independent countries to itself. And I think that this is what the United States had tried to do in the rest of the world. It has attempted imperialism. It had not succeeded in it. And of course, as I say, in this attempt, you know, if you count nuclear warheads, of course, the United States today has a slightly smaller number of nuclear warheads than Russia does. But I don't think that's either here or there. What is true is that if you want to see who is imperialist, if you just Google map of all US military bases around the world, and you will see that the entire world is dotted with American military bases. Then you can Google the number of Russian and Chinese bases around the world, and you will see how small they are, how few they are, and how they are located either directly around their own territories or at strategic points which are critical for their economies. For the defense of their economies. And historically, I would suggest to you that whether it is in nuclear weapons or in more generally elsewhere, on the whole, the military posture of the socialist countries has been defensive. They have of course defended their own territories as they should very well. But it is the military and nuclear postures of the West that has been aggressive. So, as you said, just because one country invades another doesn't mean that it is imperialist, etc. And of course, as far as Russia and Ukraine are concerned, the current topic of our discussion, of course, by the way, the fact that the Israelis are constantly settling on Palestinian territory, nobody calls Israel imperialist, when of course they should, but that's another matter altogether. But of course, we know that at the time of when the West and the Soviet Union negotiated the fall of the Berlin Wall, negotiated the unification of Germany, Gorbachev was assured that the East would not move a single inch further, because of course the absorption of East Germany into Germany meant that, of course, that NATO had objectively advanced eastwards, but then Russia was given assurances that not one further inch would. And of course, NATO has continued expanding further. It has been really in your face, and the Russian actions, well, both in 2014 and in 2022, and since, have been a reaction to that. And you could see as well, initially, after the demise of the Soviet Union, the Russians were very open to the West, very open to the United States. But already by the close of the 1990s, I would say that they were beginning to realize that they were had, that the West had played a trick on them, that the purpose was not to share Western prosperity with Russia, but rather to subordinate Russia. That Russia went through the economic ringer in the 1990s, and anybody who was alive then will be thanking Putin for stabilizing the economy, for stabilizing Russia, and so on and so forth. So that's why Putin enjoys very wide legitimacy. And I wouldn't say, I mean, the other thing as well is Putin waited for 8 years before acting on essentially this Western aggression vis-a-vis Ukraine. I don't think he particularly wanted to act, but there came a time when he was convinced that not acting would be worse than acting, and that's when he has undertaken the so-called special military operation. So that's where we are. So I wouldn't say, and a final thing I would say is that, to me, of course, you've had other types of imperialism, like, Roman Empire, or even the Ottoman or the Russian or the Austro-Hungarian empires, but they were, I would say, qualitatively different kinds of arrangements. What you have under capitalist imperialism is something else. And on that ground, these countries are not there. First of all, they're not capitalist. Russia is, of course, capitalist, but it has had the history of the Soviet Union very recently. And even today, I would say, particularly in the context of the war, particularly in the context of the need to stabilize Russia, it has had to, have very a modified form, at least, let's say, of capitalism. China is not capitalist, and plus these countries are the legatees, they are the inheritors of a very strong anti-imperialist tradition. People say that Wilson announced in his 14 points the self-determination of nations. No, I mean, the historian Arno Meyer has shown in his book, Wilson versus Lenin, that it was the Bolshevik peace decree of April, whenever it was, after the revolution, April 1917, that they were the ones who published all the secret treaties, and they pointed out that they would not support territorial annexation, that and etc. And they changed the war aims of Russia, and Russia was no longer participating anymore in the war, and so on. And and they were the ones, Lenin, from about the early 20th century onwards, Lenin was very keenly aware that supporting national liberation in third world countries was, in the colonial countries, was an absolute necessity for any communist country, for any communist party. And he had been consistent in his support since. And I would say that Wilson, in fact, in his declaration, he actually limited self-determination to European countries. He didn't extend it to the rest of the world, to the colonized world. And so Russia was one of the pioneers in this kind of anti-imperialism. And of course, China has, of course, since then followed very similar lines. So they are, if anything, anti-imperialist, and they do not have the same imperatives. If China has a problem of overproduction, it can easily expand domestic production, something that the West doesn't even have much of a problem of overproduction anymore, because it has serious productive malfunction. But anyway, it can expand its own consumption, and it can help other countries, as it already is. When DeepSeek came out with its, China shares technology with third world countries far more easily. DeepSeek has made its model, for example, open access, open source, whatever. So in all of these ways, the behavior of China and Russia is very different.
So if I get you correct, you contest the idea of hegemony and empire, and the US dominance was always partial or contested or reliant on unstable financial arrangements, such as the Bretton Woods after the Second World War, such as the petrodollar, the dominance of the US dollar as a currency that trade is traded with, that everything is traded with dollars, especially oil and gas. Coming back to the Ukraine question, do you believe that, or does the Ukraine war present, so to speak, a tipping point or decisive acceleration in multipolarity? For example, it put together, or China and Russia more closely than ever, also because of the Ukraine war. We saw it also with the Iran-Israel crisis or war, and also now the Gaza, some call it genocide, that we see that the global south is coming closer and closer, and with the BRICS emerging, so, and many countries want to join BRICS. So is there any, from a theoretical perspective, can Ukraine be a tipping point, or in history? What do you think about that?
I think there's a sense in which you're right. I mean, I see it as a kind of a more continuous flow, but yes, even the smoothest and straightest roads will have milestones around it. And definitely Ukraine was a major milestone. But let me take a couple of steps back. I mean, China is also an interesting story. So the United States in the 80s and 90s was very open towards China, wanted to integrate China into the world system and so on, encouraged China to join the WTO and everything. And when the US, this is because at that time, the US thought that China could be essentially integrated in the world system as a very pliant and subordinated country. But of course, already by the early 20th century, it became very clear that China had no intention of accepting subordination, that China was going to use whatever access it got to world markets and legitimacy it got and so on to further expand its own productive capacities and so on. And that's why you have a sort of slow build-up. You got George Bush Jr. imposing his tariffs that I've already mentioned. Then you got Obama and his pivot to Asia. Then you got, of course, Trump and his crazy obsession with China. But then Biden also not reversing any of the moves, which everybody thought he would. And now we've got Trump Mark II. But of course, through this period, so you have this increasing hostility towards countries that refuse to be subordinated. And I would say that again, in the case of Russia, you have, as I say, even Yeltsin would have nominated Putin to be the leader in a context where he himself realized that he was wrong to trust the West, that the West, despite its promises to Gorbachev, had continued expanding eastward and so on. So in that sense, I would say, and you certainly see with Putin, initially simply kind of, of course, being friendly with the West, even suggesting that Russia should join NATO and blah, blah, and so on, to becoming slowly coming to the realization by the late 2000s that, the West is not going to treat Russia with the respect that Russia deserves, so that you get his famous Munich speech of, I think, 2008 or thereabouts, when, he basically says, you folks have got some thinking to do, etc. And then, of course, slowly there's a build up to the 2014 crisis and so on. So there's also a progression vis-a-vis Russia. But what certainly has happened, you see, with the sanctions of 2014, the sanctions of 2014 further pushed Russia to engage in what I call the contender or state-directed development, which is the only way to effectively resist imperialism. So, for example, the agricultural sanctions, Europe will not export food to Russia. Fine, then the Russians had to scramble to revive their agricultural economy, something they did quite successfully. So that in the last 8 to 10 years, Russia has become one of the major agricultural exporters in the world. And of course, also expand the production of fertilizers. So it is also exporting fertilizers, what have you, etc. So all of that happened. And of course, since 2022, of course, the sanctions have become even greater. And I would say, as you rightly point out, this has pushed China and Russia ever closer together. But remember also that this also has a prelude, because the special military operation was launched after a visit by Putin to Beijing, in which the two countries announced their limitless partnership and all of these things. So in all of these ways, there was a buildup, but yes, there were also these milestones, these important turning points where the movement towards autonomy accelerated. Now, why is the world also, the rest of the world, paying attention? It's not just China and Russia that are cleaving closer together, but other countries want to join. Why is that? Simply because of the operation of the two things that I mentioned earlier. One is the decline of the West, and the other is the rise of China in particular. I mean, nothing matches what China has done. I think that's something we should remember. We speak of BRICS, but Russia comes next, and then the other BRICS countries, the core BRICS countries, India, Brazil, South Africa, particularly India under the current government, and also South Africa. And then perhaps Brazil under Lula will be a bit better, but we'll see. But basically, if you don't have the right kind of government in these countries, I mean, India's economy is being destroyed under Modi. So we don't know where that is going to go. But anyway, to come back to the main point, these other countries want to join. Why? Because of the economic gravity exerted by China and the West's complete loss of economic gravity. I mean, this saying, I think, attributed to Lawrence Summers, that, who said that, when some third world diplomat told him that, when we talk to the United States, we get a lecture. When we talk to China, we get a new bridge or a new airport or a new railroad or what have you. So I think that China has so much more to give, that the economic gravity that China is exerting cannot be resisted by anybody, actually, not even countries like Mexico or Brazil, which otherwise would be considered to be under sort of, the US sphere of influence. So that's why you have this sort of new attraction. And I think that, if these universalist institutions that were created at the end of the Second World War, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, GATT, WTO, etc., if the West refuses to reform them, as it is currently doing, then inevitably you will simply get the other countries saying, well, if you won't reform these, we'll just go and create other institutions. And that's where you get the importance of countries like or institutions like the SCO, the BRICS, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. And let's move on to my maybe final question. Also, let's stay in this field of multipolarity. I wonder, many liberal thinkers, or maybe if you watch the Western media, BRICS and this term multipolarity is seen as a threat. Some argue now we will witness more and more conflicts, more and more wars, because the world is not stable. There is no no hegemonic power that can, guard us or police us. So some are arguing like this. Others are arguing that we have this division between democracy versus autocracy. And so they are playing this dichotomy game, good versus bad, man, woman, black, white, so but from a progressive standpoint, maybe, what can we take from this, evolvement and, of the BRICS in world power, in the world politics? Is it progressive? What can we learn from it?
Okay, so let me take the point about multipolarity first. So the West basically, they try to say that, well, if the world is multipolar, it will just increase the chaos, and the more powerful states there are, there will be more aggression. Some people even think back to the First World War. That's when you last had multipolarity in this way, and so that's why we got wars and so on. Actually, to me, all of this thinking is a result of defective realist thinking. Because you see, to me, realism is a very elaborate ruse to make everybody think that since all countries will be aggressive if they can, then nobody should be surprised that the US is aggressive and Western countries are aggressive, because it's a way of naturalizing the international aggression of the big capitalist countries, of the imperialist countries. To me, but of course, if you take what I've said seriously, then you wouldn't get this international aggression without capitalism. Particularly today, without a capitalism which is already also in serious trouble, which is therefore producing a surplus of military aggression and so on. So the aggression is all emanating from the Western countries. It is not emanating from the rest of the world. And so the real danger of this world today is not that we have multipolarity. In fact, the more widely productive power is spread, the more effectively conflict will be contained, so that even a West, which is in the throes of its multiple tantrums, as I've earlier described it, must think twice before acting out these tantrums. For example, let's take the recent conflicts. The conflict with Iran. Why did you get a sudden ceasefire? You got a sudden ceasefire because everybody could see that Western weapons had not destroyed Iran's nuclear capability, although some people were banging the drums about having done exactly that. This has not happened. Or to take the other odd little conflict we had recently between India and Pakistan. No doubt the West was egging India on. The West supplies India with a lot of weapons. But in that brief conflict, Pakistan was able to perform much better with weapons supplied by China than India was performing. And so this is, so even militarily, I mean, this is another whole subject of discussion, but the West is not winning. So, but nevertheless, to come back to the multipolarity itself is not a threat. What threatens the world today is the West's refusal to accept that it must now live in a world that is even more multipolar than it was in 1945 or in 1980 or what have you. So in that sense, I think the danger emanates from the West, and the danger emanates from the West not because it's the West, but because it's capitalist. And this has created certain imperatives, certain outlooks, certain discourses. So and of course the democracy autocracy thing, that is just a way of justifying what's happening. In fact, essentially, the West does not, the capitalism does not have to be democratic. It has to be liberal in the sense that it has to have a regime that protects property rights in particular and certain other rights associated with that. But beyond that, the West can do with a fairly elitist representative system, or could do with that back in the 19th century when there was no universal franchise. And in many ways, I would say that today, when I go to China or Russia, as I do quite often, I find that their governments enjoy much greater, deeper, and broader legitimacy than Western governments have today. In Europe, for example, where you are, the slavishness with which European governments are accepting the very dangerous American agenda, which is actually egging Europe on. I mean, today it is Ukraine. Tomorrow, the United States will say that the Europeans should fight a war. In fact, it's already saying that, and many European governments are accepting this. And ordinary Europeans are very upset about this. I remember hearing on BBC, of all places, which does not normally report such things, but a young man being interviewed on the streets of Berlin, and he said, I'd rather be occupied than dead, because he said, you're all talking about conscription. Well, who are you going to conscript? You're going to conscript people like me, people of my age. I could be dead. I don't want to die, etc. So you can see, you know, naturally, and this is, you know, and, you know, people also forget that any people's willingness to fight for their own defense of their own country, of their own society, it will always be many times greater than their willingness to fight for some crazy imperialist cause, which is going to benefit a small number of rich people. So in that sense, you know, the West is declining. So again, to come back to democracy and autocracy, the West is not showing its democratic colors very well. And they call any country that restricts the power of capital autocratic. But quite frankly, that's where we all need to go. We all need to live in societies where the power of capital is much more restricted than it is today, after 45 plus years of neoliberalism. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but that's I think what I could think of. If I've forgotten any aspect, just remind me.
Absolutely. And the final aspect was the progressive part. Maybe I can think of, for example, widening the UN Security Council, maybe the permanent members. There should be a minimum an African nation, you know, India and many others. So maybe this is also, we can democratize global politics. So, but maybe you can also mention other dimensions.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that as far as the expansion of the Security Council is concerned, it's just not feasible, at least not in the current mood the West is in, that the West will ever accept it. However, I do think that, you know, when people complain about the fact that the Security Council is the sphere of big powers, that the West, precisely because of the centrality of the Soviet Union and of Chinese forces in winning the Second World War, had to include China and Russia, or Soviet Union, in it. Although, of course, present-day China and present-day Russia have got there by various means. But the fact is that these two countries remain important checks on Western power. You know, the Korean War was launched when the Soviet Union was absent from the Security Council. The Libyan adventure was launched by essentially beguiling China and Russia into thinking that it would be something other than what it became. And China and Russia have never forgotten that. And so they have acted as important checks on Western power. And that's partly why you've needed NATO. The West has needed NATO to do all those things that the UN Security Council would never do, because the Soviet Union and the PRC, and today Russia and the PRC, are represented on that body. So in that sense, I would say that while, of course, ideally we should have a much more democratic system, this is not going to happen, and B, actually, there are stronger elements of democracy in the sense of the representation of important interests of the world, anti-imperialist interests of the world. They're already there. They've had to be there because, you know, imperialism back in the 40s was not even sufficiently powerful to settle its own affairs. It needed the help of socialist countries or communist forces, in China's case, to do that. So that's why we are in a, you know, just imagine if these two countries didn't exist, we would have had unrestrained imperialism, and probably as a result more world wars. You know, I've often wondered, I've read as much as I can about where the term World War comes from, but I think that basically it emerges, the idea of the World War emerges because in 1914 and from the late 19th century onwards, so much of the world was under European domination that any war between European powers would inevitably involve the whole world, because the European powers would bring in their colonial armies and so on, as indeed they did. At least we now live in a more multipolar world, where part of the reason, at least, why conflicts are more contained is because these countries don't have the colonies that they could drag into war willy-nilly.
Thank you for your answer, and thank you for your time. I appreciate, and it was a great honor, and I learned a lot from your books and papers, and yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and it was absolutely great pleasure to talk to you.